A major political crisis is essentially about to explode on Peru, given the fact that President Pedro Castillo recently announced the resignation of his Prime Minister, Guido Bellido. Of course, we're talking about a massive situation considering that the resignation of Guido Bellido, according to the Peruvian laws, basically indicates and has as the main consequence that the whole cabinet of President Pedro Castillo has to resign, and they indeed resign. The most damaging situation was that when Pedro Castillo announced the resignation of Guido Bellido, he simply said that Bellido essentially gave him a resignation letter and he simply accepted. However, Bellido eventually said to the media outlets of Peru that the situation was essentially that the president itself asked him to take this decision, that President Pedro Castillo asked his own prime minister that he should resignate, that he should quit his position. So he did. Of course, this is a pretty delicate situation if we take into consideration that we're basically talking about Peru. Peru has always been a country that has been characterized by having all sorts of political crises, almost for any single reason. After all, the legislative branch in Peru, it's extremely powerful and has many laws that the executive branch simply cannot violate. Of course, this is the same situation in almost every single democracy around the world, but the power that it has, the legislative branch in this country is way more powerful and way bigger than many other democracies, especially in Latin America. I mean, we have seen over the last few years that Peru has had many presidents in a single year, being some kind of the South American version of Italian politics, basically. So, of course, once Pedro Castillo announced the resignation of Guido Bellido, he only took a couple of days until he announced the substitute for his former prime minister, and he picked Mirta Vázquez, who is basically one of the main members of the moderate leftist faction of the Peruvian opposition. So this could be considered a pretty good sign that the government of Pedro Castillo won't be the radical government that will eventually become a tyranny, as many people thought, because having as prime minister someone as Mirta Vázquez would probably represent an inevitable moderation of his government. And of course, this move is also made by the fact that the Congress, the Peruvian Congress, is mostly controlled by the opposition, and that Congress had many clashes with Guido Bellido, especially after opening different investigations that basically wanted to determine whether he was part of different terrorist operations in Peru with the famous Maoist terrorist group Sendero Luminoso or not. So picking Mirta Vázquez as the new prime minister, of course, will inevitably represent a setback for Pedro Castillo, but at the same time could probably guarantee his presence at the presidency at least until his mandate ends, considering that Mirta Vázquez is one of the main members of the center-left opposition. So this will mean that the new prime minister of Peru, will probably have a decent relationship with the Congress, which of course will mean that Pedro Castillo won't end as the last Peruvian president. Reporting from Medellin, Colombia, Luis Orozco, Newsweek.